Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Corey Yoder of Coriander Quilts, and today I have a little topic that has been bothering me for probably years. If you saw the title of this video, it's going to say something to the effect of why I am no longer labeling my quilt patterns with skill levels like intermediate or beginner. And that may have caught you off guard because you're probably thinking, Corey, we need that on patterns so we know if we are able to make them or not. That's so helpful. But hear me out. I'm going to chat about this. You're getting a deep dive into my brain and how things work in there a little bit. And at the end of the video, I really do need your help with something. So be sure to watch to the end and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. So stick around. I have been designing quilt patterns for probably, I don't know, 15 years or so, maybe longer than that. I've had my pattern company since 2014, and the labeling of quilt patterns with those skill levels has bothered me for the whole entire time, and I have avoided placing those labels until last year when I started labeling my patterns with the skill level. So Starberry, Coriander Colors, and then Callie & Co. When you look at the back of my patterns, they have the skill level listed on them. But it bothers me to no end that they have those labels on there. And here are my two problems with having that information on a pattern. Number one, there is no industry standard for what constitutes a beginning level pattern versus an intermediate level pattern. So what I think is beginner might be something quite different than what pattern designer Mary constitutes as beginner. For me, I think that a beginner quilt pattern is something that is very beginner. Maybe we aren't comfortable with our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Maybe we've only been making quilts for a short time frame and we don't know quilting terminology. We aren't very confident in using a rotary cutter. We don't have a lot of different rulers that we're confident using. We've never made half square triangles or flying geese units. And we are really in the beginning stages of learning about quilt making. To me, that's a beginner quilter. Other quilt pattern designers think that a beginner may be someone who has been quilting for a short time frame, but they are pretty confident with their 1/4 inch seam allowance. They understand how to cut pieces for making quilts. They know the different parts on their sewing machine. They have made half square triangle units, flying geese units. They understand how to do stitch and flip corners, those snowball corners. And that might be what they think is a beginner quilter. And those labels that we are putting on our quilt patterns can vary quite a bit. Maybe it's simply the length of time that someone has been making quilts. Maybe if you've been making quilts for a year or less, that constitutes you being a beginning quilter. But maybe other quilt pattern designers don't have that same thinking. And even that by itself is a little bit of a problem because I know that there are quilt makers who, as soon as they start making quilts, they dive in and they are all in, and they might make 6 to 10 quilts in that first year that they have been making quilts. Whereas Quilter B might have been making quilts for 10 years, but they don't make a quilt a year, and maybe they've only made 5 quilts in that 10-year time frame. Is the 10-year quilter more of a beginner than the 1-year quilter? Not based on the number of quilts that they've made. So that's the one thing, the first thing that I wanted to touch on that bothers me about the labeling of quilt pattern skill levels. The second thing is that I really think it's very dependent on the individual quilter as to how confident, how successful they're going to be approaching a quilt pattern. For example, my first quilt was this quilt right here. And by just looking at it, this would not be labeled a beginner quilt. It has hand applique on it, which is not typically a beginner technique. This section here, without the applique, could be beginner, but as a whole, this would not be labeled a beginner quilt. Did I have trouble making this quilt? No. Was I confident making this quilt? Yes. Was I successful? Yes. But if someone had said, hey, whoa, you are diving into applique way too quickly, that is a more difficult technique, I might have shied away from making this quilt pattern. And I really don't like things in quilt making that deter or discourage us from trying things that we may very well be able to do. Two other quilts that I made probably in the first year, maybe 2 years that I was making quilts. This one right here, another applique quilt, all hand applique. Again, people would argue that hand applique is not necessarily a beginner technique. And then this quilt right here, it's all squares, but these are 1-inch finished squares. And oftentimes people think that piecing small pieces makes quilt patterns difficult, maybe not as beginner friendly. I had no trouble piecing all of these quilts. I didn't run into any problems. I read the instructions, followed the directions, used the illustrations, and was able to successfully make these quilts that weren't technically beginner quilts. And my fear with some of these quilt labels is that it does deter people from trying things that they would otherwise be able to try to do to have success. At the same time, I am well aware that some people would make a quilt that they felt was within their skill level and learn that it was too difficult for them. They didn't enjoy it. The techniques within the quilt were just too hard for them, and it just didn't work out. And that can actually turn people away also, where there are things that might be too tricky at some stages of your quilt making game. And so you want to know up front if you can tackle this project successfully, because that's another thing that can be very discouraging, is to try something and it just not work out. And it can actually turn quilters away from continuing making quilts because they had a quilt that they tried to tackle that just was not successful for them. So those two things weigh on my mind every time I think about labeling quilts with a skill level. And so it just came up again yesterday. I had someone leave a comment for me on my blog asking if I ever have any beginner-friendly quilt-alongs, because I would typically label my quilt-alongs as intermediate because they are definitely more than just squares and rectangles and simple piecing. And so I automatically label them intermediate. And I know that that kind of scares people away because they might not consider themselves to be an intermediate quilter. So I saw it happen again yesterday, and I thought, yes, my patterns and my quilt-alongs I would call intermediate, but I know that there are beginners that would be able to successfully complete my patterns and my quilt-alongs, and so this bothers me. So I was thinking about that this morning, and what I'm going to start doing in lieu of using that designated skill level, advanced, intermediate, beginner. Instead, I am going to list on my patterns what techniques are utilized within that pattern and leave it up to you. You know your skill set the best. You know what you feel confident doing and what you are willing to tackle and what you might not yet be willing to tackle. Leave it up to the person making the quilt to decide if this is a quilt pattern that will work for them. So for example, I made a little list, and this is where I need your help because I might not be thinking of some of the different things that you would want to know in advance of purchasing a quilt pattern. So some of the things that I would like to include, so it will say maybe skill set required or suggested skills, something like that, and then it will list these different things. So the amount of cutting in the project. I've heard that sometimes people are intimidated if there is a lot of rotary cutting in a project. Lots of little pieces, lots of cutting in general. Working with big pieces of yardage can sometimes be kind of intimidating. So if you knew up front, hey, this quilt pattern has a lot of cutting, it's going to take a fair amount of time to cut. That might be something that would be helpful. Is there small piecing? You know, I mentioned when I was talking about this quilt that small piecing can sometimes be a deterrent. So if you knew up front, there are some small pieces that we are going to be working with within this quilt pattern. That could be very helpful. Of course, you would want to know the size of the blocks and the size of the quilt. I always include the size of the quilt on the back of my pattern, so you know if this is a big quilt. Oftentimes people want to make smaller quilts when they're first starting, maybe wall hangings or throw-sized quilts before they dive into a queen or a king-sized quilt. So that's always information that I include. But additionally, the size of the quilt blocks. I had someone just last week ask me about the size of a quilt block for a specific pattern because they said larger blocks are harder for them to make, like for example 18-inch blocks are trickier for them to make rather than 12-inch blocks. So just having that information up front I think would be very helpful. And then what units are we making in our quilt? Half square triangles, flying geese, stitch and flip, square and a square. All of those different quilters feel different ways about. So if you knew that a quilt pattern had a bunch of flying geese, or you're going to be making a lot of half square triangles, that would help you know if that's something that you feel confident in tackling. Those were the things I thought of off the top of my head. But if there are other techniques, information that you always think about when you are purchasing a quilt pattern that you would like to see included on the back of a pattern so that you knew ahead of time what you were getting yourself into, I would love to hear what those things would be, because that's just going to help me come up with better information to include on the back of that pattern so that each quilter can decide for themselves if this is a pattern that works for them or one maybe they're going to stick on the back burner or opt out of altogether. I know that everybody is different. We all have those different quilting tools we use. We have different fabric preferences, techniques that we use, and we all know best for ourselves if what is needed to make a quilt is going to work for us. And so I would love to just include that information and let everybody decide themselves, is this a pattern for me? Those are my thoughts. I am definitely going to be doing this going forward. I am working on a set of patterns right now that will come out in a few months. And so I am going to be switching my patterns going forward over to this new method of relaying the skills needed to make a pattern. I think it's going to be a much nicer way to allow each person to individually decide what works best for them. So definitely let me know what you think. I love this idea. It sits better with me. And so I'm going to go ahead and do it. But if you have other things that you would love to know when you are thinking about quilt patterns, and if you want to make it, be sure to let me know. If you have any questions or suggestions, I'd love to hear them. I thank you so much for stopping by, and I will catch you again next time.